true to our time and commitment to you to be organized in our presentation. Good afternoon. I'm Grant Swartzwelder, President of OTA Environmental Solutions and the host of the Oilfield Strong webinar series. Appreciate you joining us for yet another of our monthly presentations. As you all know, it's the first Wednesday of every month, so it kind of came at an awkward time here since most of us are just back from the holidays. So do appreciate y'all taking the time to be here. We will be visiting with our guests for a period of time, and then later on tonight we will have it on our YouTube channel. So just look up OTA compression on YouTube, and you'll be able to hear or share the presentation that Jack will be making with anybody else that you might be interested in sharing it with. Let's jump directly into it. I am so happy to have Jack Blears as our presenter today. I've known him quite some time, always find his conversation and his comments very enlightful. And he is the Director of E&P Technology Research at Darcy Partners. So it sounds like you're really smart. So, so with that title, you're going to be, you're already sitting a high hurdle there. But he has been involved with looking at upstream technologies and how that affects a lot of his clients. I'm going to ask him to talk about Darcy Partners because I hadn't heard of it until about a year ago. And probably most of you have, but just in case, he'll give that context. But he basically brings technology to companies, helps screens them, understands them, tries to help his customers understand how it can benefit them. So what we've asked him to do today is to, in 30 minutes, basically help us understand all of the technology that's affecting emissions. So we'll probably have extra time left over, right, Jack? We can do it that quick. But no, I think there is so much happening in this marketplace with technology, whether it's emissions monitoring, satellites, fixed wings, on and on. I think there's a lot of pros and cons associated with that. But I think a lot of people continue to try to get their hands around that. But so first thing is, though, Jack, welcome. And if you would, let everyone know what Darcy Partners is. Kind of, you have to earn your keep here. Explain kind of what you do, and then we'll jump into kind of some of the methane detection technologies.
Yeah, that sounds great, Grant, and I really appreciate you giving me some airtime here. And it's great to be the first show of 2022. So I put together some visual aids here to help explain. Say pictures worth 1,000 words, but this slide here is meant to give the vision of Darcy Partners. And essentially, Darcy was formed in 2015 with the goal of really just helping improve the way that the energy industry innovates. And our key insight was that there's a lot of platforms that had been very helpful in our everyday lives to improve our everyday decision making. And we wanted to bring that into the energy space. So whether you're shopping for something and you have a platform like Amazon, or you're trying to do networking, you have a platform like LinkedIn, we really wanted to bring that as an analog to the energy space and into a B2B context. So we're not trying to replace live sessions, although it's getting harder to do that, obviously, with COVID. We're trying to complement that experience and basically use an online platform to help bring technology providers that are emerging together with E&P operators that need those innovation solutions to keep succeeding in the industry. And then the only other caveat there is that we're fully funded by E&P operators, so we have no financial ties to technology providers. There's no percentage of deals that get done through us. So if you see any logos on any slides today, just keep in mind that there's no kind of financial ties. We're not advertising for anybody here. We're just trying to be independent, unbiased for our members. And then I'll do one more slide here, Grant, just to show what our research covers. So we do a lot in the oil and gas space, so cover all the core disciplines, subsurface, D&C production. We also have a sustainability arm, which I oversee. Obviously, methane detection is a big topic and one we'll touch on today. But we also, just as an FYI, we cover energy transition and power and utilities. And that's enough on the about Darcy.
Very good. Well, yet again, you've proven that other people do a much better job of introducing themselves than I do. So, and I'm glad for that. So, well, let's move into that methane monitoring. And if you would kind of start off kind of more general, kind of what you're seeing conceptually and how it's moving, and then we can move into some specifics of some of the technologies.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll go back to my visual aid here, Grant, and we'll do some of we'll basically boil it down to the three key themes that we're seeing for 2022. And really, when we see the space, it's coming down to three key spaces. So one is we're looking at certification. As detection technologies have gotten lower cost, there's a lot more interest in operators wanting to differentiate themselves and prove basically that the emissions that they're having are actually what they say they are. There's some wrinkles in there about how that is a challenge just to begin with because of things like emissions factors, and how what you report to the EPA is done can be hard to get credit. And that's where certification comes in. Next, we have continuous monitoring as a trend, basically trying to find those super emitters as quickly as possible as an alternative to some of the fixed wing and the satellite technologies. And then last but not least, how do you actually integrate all this data into these platforms to make that data useful and so you can actually act on it. So I'd say those are the key trends that we're seeing. And then I can jump into the actual tech and the pros and cons from there. So let me go back to it.
Okay.
And so before I talk a little bit about the specific technologies, I wanted to give a little bit of context. So this is some survey data from our E&P members. This spans the whole industry basically, but when we ask our members what is the most important topic within ESG, methane, we have about 90% say that it's the most important topic or is one of the most important topics. So basically what I'm trying to say is that methane among the E&P, when you ask them, is one of the top technology areas that they're concerned with. And when you ask,
and I assume most of that's just because that's some of the bigger blowback from a public relations, from a kind of the environmental groups, the market is demanding that. They're just responding to the PR aspect of it.
Well, we were curious about that as well, Grant. So you set me up well. And so we actually asked the members, what's the biggest driver behind implementing these detection solutions that aren't required by regulations? And what we see among the members, and we're mostly asking engineering managers, engineer types, rather than sort of the public relations types. But what we see is that the biggest driver is expected changes in regulations, followed by wanting to prevent a loss of products. And then last is actually that push from the investors. So it is a significant factor, but really the biggest drivers these days are still concerns about pending regulation changes, as well as preventing that loss of product.
Okay.
And then I'll go through a little bit more. This is probably too much, but the main thing here is just that if you look at all of the sources of emissions, the key trend is still, at least the last couple of years, has been to find the super emitters, because they contribute disproportionately to the total emissions in the industry. So about 5% of leak sources contribute to about 80% of the volume. And because methane packs a bigger GHG punch, basically a smaller amount of methane detection or methane emissions can make it so that the methane is a bigger cause of the total than CO2. So that's the big picture on why methane is so important. But when you get into the right-hand side here, and we talk about what are the issues for detection technologies, there's a lot of trade-offs that all the operators out there are having to deal with any of these solutions. So these are the key things to keep in mind. One is the sensitivity. So how accurately can you detect a leak? What's the frequency? How often can you go and detect these leaks? Localization is how accurately can you place that leak? Can you know where within a given facility or pad is that leak coming from? Quantification, so can you tell exactly how much is coming out versus just knowing is it there or not there? And then last but not least, cost and regulations. So is this something that's going to be complementary, or is this just going to be an additional cost? So those are the key things to keep in mind. And then here's the slide where we've put together really the 5-6 different types of technology detection options that are out there. And I can run through the pros and cons of each of these. But keep in mind that each one of these has a number of companies behind it. They're all doing good work. And I think it's an exciting time really, because you have ongoing active pilots in all of these different areas. And as these pilots wrap up through JIPs and things like that, the capabilities, the understanding of what can be done is really evolving very quickly, which makes it hard to keep up with, but it is exciting. And then the last thing I'll say on the high level here is just that the spoiler alert is that it's not one technology that's going to beat all others. It's just kind of a variable in importance depending on what your assets look like. And as we progress through time, I think there's going to be differences in what's important as we go from just finding and fixing super emitters to eventually needing to find smaller and smaller leaks. So that's the big picture. Let me get my laser pointer out.
Let's talk about this a couple of times. So it
Yeah.
does always seem that the size of the leak really matters. That, you know, satellite and pilot, you can see bigger things, but if you're trying to really find the pinhole, the little valve, it's not going to see that. Or is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that might be more of just my perception, but it's the other thing is that a lot of these, like, there almost seems to be a fad to have the satellite, to have the drone. Those just look good. They sound technical. Help me understand if it really solves something.
Yeah, that's a good question, Grant. I think you're right. I'll walk through sort of the various thresholds that you can get with these different technologies. And it goes back to what is it that you're actually looking for. So on the satellites, their big advantage is their low cost. Because they have the biggest aerial coverage, you're going to be able to get the lowest cost among all of these technology options. So that's part of the reason why it's popular. Also, if you're in a remote location, it's going to be cheaper. So if you're offshore specifically, that's going to be beneficial. On the challenge side, the detection rate is very large. It's about 1,000 MSDF per day. There's a next generation of satellites that's coming out with higher sensitivity, maybe down to 100, but that's going to be coming down the pipeline in the future. So the next thing we have, though, is piloted aircraft, and this is where we see most of the operator attention, because you have a really good balance of cost, coverage, and accuracy down closer to 25 MSDF per day. And so because of that, you can scan a pretty wide range of area at a reasonable cost. Most folks are doing it about quarterly, and basically you're able to find leaks that are and get a pretty good idea of where they're coming from. This one's coming from a Bridger Photonics, so you can see that accuracy. And then last, on the kind of aerial type surveys, we have UAVs or drones, where this can get down to 1 MSCF per day, but because of the challenges of needing line of sight for these drones, the cost can be quite high. So unless you're doing something like pipeline monitoring, where you're kind of going back and forth, you have fixed areas, that this is one that we've seen maybe a little bit less attention. But that being said, there's still a lot of interest in it. A company called CCOPS actually raised quite a bit of money in their Series B. They have backing from Equinor and OGCI. So there's a lot of interest there. This is going to be kind of the highest resolution possible among the flying types. It can also get a lot lower, but from a bang for your buck, I think piloted aircraft is where most folks are paying attention these days.
So, but like on the piloted aircraft, you say good identification, but what, you know, when you go down, what size area is that? Like, you know, that it looks like, okay, here's the spot, but is that can you narrow it down to a 3 foot by 3 foot, so when you can go and actually fix it right there, or you're like, okay, it's in this general area and now we need to go and identify where the actual leak is?
Yeah, it depends on the path that it's being taken. So let me back out of here and find, there's a few different ways of deploying those aerial technologies. So I'll pull up one more slide here. And so the specifics kind of depend on how you're running these things. So if you're doing a LiDAR system where you're going around a specific asset, maybe you're doing a ring around it, or you're doing a really clear flyby, then you can get down to pretty high resolution, as you can see, pinpoint that.
Okay.
Other folks are doing more of these kind of lawnmower type coverages, so you're going back and forth. So you're not going to have quite the same resolution, but it's going to be a higher cost there. So it kind of really just depends on how you're deploying these technologies.
Okay, that makes sense.
But good question.
Are you going back to your, I'm sorry, I'm kind of messed up your presentation.
No worries.
Are you
yeah, I'll go back to this slide here.
There you go. Thank you.
Because I think the other alternative here, though, that we're seeing a lot of attention in is more of these continuous monitoring solutions. So OGI is the baseline that's not really continuous, but we have point sensors and regional sensors that are gaining a lot of attraction too on the continuous side, where basically you can have a fixed camera or laser system that sits on a tower and does a 360-degree scan all day, all night, and can just ping the laser off of reflectors and basically have high density of detection over a large area. So it's an interesting alternative to point sensors, where there's still a lot of debate on how many of those sensors do you need per pad, how high off the ground do they need to be to actually see kind of a leak and make sure there's no false positives. So that's the other alternative that we're seeing a lot of interest in.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. So on the point sensor, you kind of threw that out, and that's something curious, because how many do you need? And obviously that has a direct effect on cost, on visibility, on operational. It's are you seeing, or this might be too detailed, but are you seeing a certain trend that you got to have 3 or 4 or 5, or how's that working?
Yeah, I think the true answer is that the industry doesn't know, but we could get a lot better information this year. There's a big study out there actively going on called Project Falcon. It's being led by a company called Scientific Aviation. I think they have about a dozen operators, where they basically banded together industry project and said, okay, I'm going to put 3 sensors on this pad. You can put 5 on yours, and we're going to vary the height of these sensors. And so as this pilot wraps up, they're going to have a lot of good data on the specifics of how many do you need, how high up, what's the orientation that you need. So right now it's kind of an open question, but it's one that is been very important for obvious reasons. That's going to impact how cost effective these point sensors can be.
And those are sensors, and the regional sensor, we talked about those being lasers. Is that the same thing? Or is that a different technology?
Yeah, let me flip through, because it is a little bit different. Here we go. So I blurred out some of the logos here, but when it comes to continuous monitoring, you basically have 2 options. There's point sensors, which could either be metal oxide point sensors, which are kind of the lowest cost. They have low power use, and the challenge that you need a lot of them on the location, but it could be good enough to catch large emissions. If you want really high resolution, high sensitivity, that's where you're going to need these higher cost laser spectroscopy point sensors. And this is different than these fixed systems that I mentioned that are sitting on a tower, which could either be a camera-based system or could be that kind of regional laser scanning type system.
And do you think that is a laser-based sensor, if they're able to see that from and go 360, that seems like that's a lot more detailed or a lot more better resolution, but I assume it's also a lot more cost. Is that there? Because
yeah, it's a little counterintuitive, Grant, because you're monitoring a much larger area. Those laser systems can go out to about 1.5 mile radius. So you basically just need one system, and they put these low-cost reflectors on anywhere. You could have multiple of those reflectors on a given pad. So it scans and bounces a laser off those reflectors, and it determines a concentration of methane on that beam path for that laser. So you can scan pretty well across a broad area. The challenge is more if you have a hilly area or you have some kind of visual blockage. Now you're going to run into trouble with those laser systems. So really good solution for Permian type situation where you're in the desert, less so if you're up in Appalachia.
And on that, like how many of those little reflectors do you have to have on a location? Is it, and I guess the more you have, then the more detailed information, more location you can get, because it seems like if you only have 3, then you might have a leak, but you have no clue where it's coming from.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reflectors are cheap, so you can put basically as many as you like. The more you have, the slower you're going to have to go from place to place, but it's a pretty good option if you if you have a lot of assets in a concentrated area. If you just have a handful of assets that you're trying to monitor spread over a very large distance, that's another challenge for those kinds of solutions. And there's kind of a cost benefit where eventually, if things are so spread out, you're going to want something that's more just point sensors.
And isn't this the technology that some of the environmental groups are using to try to get general market information, and feel free to tell me I'm wrong. For some reason, I thought that there were some third parties doing this just to kind of see what the industry was doing. Is that right or wrong?
Yeah, I personally haven't heard of the laser sensors being used. I know for a fact I'll just skip up to this slide here. The EDF did one. I think that's a trend we're going to see more and more of, though, is basically as detection technology gets cheaper, it's going to be able to be more used by non-operators, non-regulators. So here was a study that the EDF did on flaring intensity, where they're using their own satellite, or they're using satellite data and basically comparing their own data to specific operators. And they came out with a crib sheet here where they ranked operators based off of where they fell in their respective groups and kind of called people out. And so this kind of public visibility into your assets is going to be increasingly stringent as these technologies improve. So it's just more impetus for operators to get ahead of the curve, understand their own assets, and sort of grade themselves before they're graded by somebody else.
Well, and that's on the sensors, but I guess they're also doing fixed wings, they're doing satellites. So a lot of these environmental groups are kind of being the big brother on using all of these technologies to kind of publicly expose operators.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. Interesting. It's if you're a middle-sized oil company, well, let me back up. And what size of an oil company should worry about this type of continuous monitoring or this technology? When does it, do you have any sense as to what size company you need to be to really get into certain types of these technologies, and to what degree? Or I'm sure it's good for everyone, but there is a cost, there is a technology aspect to it. So at because most of the folks I'm hearing that's doing it, they're the Chevrons and the Exxons and maybe the Diamondbacks, but it kind of drops off after that.
Yeah, that's an important question to ask. And I think you do see that a lot, where you get a lot of the headlines taken by the majors. So last year, we saw Exxon apply for an AMEL application with a piloted wing aircraft, which is basically trying to get equivalency for their asset, for their area, so on equivalency for OGI. So we see them making headlines, but we also did a session last year. We had Triple Crown present, and they had used a fixed wing aircraft survey to just be able to have a positive ROI case just by finding and fixing the leaks with basically a survey that paid for itself. And so they're not that large of an operator. They have some benefits like having condensed assets, but you certainly don't need to be a large operator to take advantage of these, because one of that regulatory pressure is going to impact everybody once it comes, and two, basically there's an ROI positive case to be had if you can do the detection cheaply enough with like a regional type sensor, whether that's a fixed wing aircraft or maybe one of these kind of laser solutions.
And then you drop that. We actually, for full disclosure, OTA does a lot of handheld OGI camera inspections and repair right then. And we're always looking at, like, you compare that to some of these fixed wings or drones that identify it, but then you still have to go on location and fix it. Have y'all looked at the cost? Because in a way there's doubling the cost, but then if you don't have any leaks, and you don't have to go on location, but chance of not having any leaks is slim. So I'm just, trying to understand the cost benefit of those monitoring versus just going on the ground and fixing it right then.
Yeah, it's a tough variable. There's a lot of variables to that equation, which is why I think a lot of people just do a small pilot with one of those detection technologies to try and say, okay, we have so many assets, so let's just look at one and see what this is to get an idea before we go do a full rollout. But we saw, I'll show some information from a paper. Well, actually, I'll just talk through it. But basically, the trade-offs that you're looking at are how quickly can you find that leak. So if you're waiting to go for a scheduled survey, you could be missing emissions for a larger period of time before that happens. So yes, you can fix it on the spot, But if you're unaware that it's there for a long period of time, now you're missing out on, basically having revenue go up in the air. And then the other one is really more talking about the intermittent. So unless you have a continuous monitoring solution out there, you're really never going to be able to find a short-lived leak that maybe it spikes every, so often, and just the days that you happen to go do your OGI, you just happen to not catch it. Whereas with a continuous solution, you can basically verify that you've caught all the leaks that you could catch because you're seeing them all. So those are really the two trade-offs, but it's hard to give obviously it's going to be variable depending on who's doing it. But that's where I think the next trend that we do see is a lot of folks trying to actually integrate not only the detection, but also the detection with the dispatch and the fixing of these technologies, and ultimately getting to the root cause, because I think that's the end game here, is that you figure out what is leaking the most, and you go out there, and if it's a pneumatic valve, then you find out what's causing those valve failures and you fix it so they don't happen in the future.
Yeah, it's funny, the best way to take care of an emissions problem is to fix the leak on the location. And that sometimes I think gets lost in the whole cloud of data and reporting and all that. So it's, but speaking of data and reporting, so how do you then take all of this information and turn that into either usable data or data that you have to report to EPA or to your bank or whoever you're going to be reporting to? And kind of aside of that, since I'm going to just keep asking a lot of questions and pile it all on you, is that it just seems like that data and being able to report to people is going to become more and more and more important.
Yeah.
Let me keep asking questions, or is that enough?
No, that's a good question. And something is one of the themes that we see. I'll share screen one more time here and just say that from our standpoint, the way we see the market is how many companies are out there trying to solve that problem. And so I blurred out the logos here, but you can kind of read through the lines here and see that there's a whole lot of companies that are emerging to solve those very problems. Folks are finding different angles to take to try to be best in class in things like market intelligence. So just benchmarking yourself using things like publicly available data, all the way into, okay, I can use my proprietary data, but how do I feed that into a report automated so I don't have to do the same checks every single time, into what we were talking about earlier on field optimization. So how do I link the detection with my dispatch and the supply chain and all that? So it's definitely a big proliferation of tech providers in this space. It's almost like the Wild West out there, but we'll see probably some winners and emerge in the next couple of years in this space.
So if I'm an operator and I take one of these areas and I have 7 or 8 people, and I'm sure there's even more than that, either that can do it or say they can do it, how do I navigate that to be able to make the right decision? That seems, back to your point about the Wild West, seems like there's a lot of waste or a lot of circling that could go on.
Well, there's, I don't know if you're trying to set us up, but that's something that I would say is in Darcy's wheelhouse. And there's a number of ways you could do it, but I think most folks would do it the way that most of the innovation happens, is using your own interpersonal networks. Somebody finds something that works for them and it trickles through the grapevine. With Darcy, we would say that works, but maybe there's a more efficient way where our company would go and have active conversations with all these blurred out logos on this page, get to know them, get to know who's using them, and basically try to do our own due diligence for the industry so that next time somebody calls, we can help facilitate interactions and help with collaboration. I think in the general, though, this space is really good for collaboration because nobody's got the full solution and everybody's trying to learn, and it's kind of a situation where the rising tide lifts all boats. So where we do see good solutions, we anticipate folks to be pretty open about what's working. Whereas things might be a little bit more competitive on, say, the next artificial lift technology that you're deploying and things like that.
Back on data real quick, and I know we're close to running out of time. So, but of all this information, what are you seeing? I think another question I'm hearing is what they're asking, what are they supposed to be reporting? Is it, and you're hearing methane intensity is now one of the big buzzwords. It's been for a while, greenhouse gas, but what are you hearing as far as the 2, 3, 4 things that your customers or your clients are like by God, I need to have a handle on this and present this?
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure, because it kind of depends who you're asking and what the end goal is. If you're trying to feed into, we'll say, a broader ESG report, and then there's all sorts of metrics around social and governance, and different ratings agencies are out there that have different requirements, and they all, because there's a lot of them out there, because there's no standards, there's a lot of people asking for different things. So yeah, it definitely is a bit challenging there. On the purely environmental side, I would say the key ones that are being measured, as you said, is one is big one is methane intensity. I forget what the exact number is, but your methane intensity doesn't need to be that high for your clean gas or cleaner burning gas to actually be dirtier than coal. So that's definitely one that is a big metric. But things around wastewater is definitely getting a big and percent that's recycled and disposed of. And obviously we had that big event in the Permian recently with the induced seismicity. So that's already starting to have an impact on how wastewater disposal goes. So we expect that to go be a bigger trend this year as well.
And one that always seems like it should be really a big issue, but because you can't really see it or monetize it, it's probably not going to be. And that's all these inactive wells and orphan wells and what's going on down below the well, 6,000 feet with all the water zones commingling and brackish water. And it seems like there's a lot of environmental challenges happening down there, but you can't see it. So people just can't do anything about it. But maybe that's more of me being on my soapbox than anything there, Jack. So it's, well, Jack, we are out of time. Thank you. This, I think we could keep going for hours on this and be beneficial. Do you want to, if people want to reach out to you, I don't want to be a homer for Darcy, but heck, why not?
Yeah.
But if they want to reach out, do you want to provide any type of contact for them?
Yeah, I'll flash the contact info slide here, but feel free to hand out my email. It's here at the bottom. It's jack@darcypartners.com. So feel free to reach out to me. Pretty easy to get a hold of, but if you want to share that in the chat or something, by all means.
Okay. And if people don't get that, you can reach out to me and I'll provide Jack's information. Always a lot of wealth of information, Jack, and yet again here. So thank you all for attending. If you have any questions, you can either reach out to me or to Jack or go on to our YouTube channel again. Again, the first Wednesday of every month, we'll be having one of these and look forward to your continued participation. Jack, thank you very much, sir. And you have a great
thank
day.
you very much, Grant, for the opportunity. It was great to chat and have a successful 2022 for everybody.
Same to you. Take care, everyone.